esteemed guests, please welcome Maya Tolstoy and President of Georgia, Her Excellency Salome Zourabichvili.
Welcome to Columbia World Leaders Forum. I'd like to begin by acknowledging our co-sponsors, the Harriman Institute and the European Institute. I'd like to thank Alexander Cooley, Director of the Harriman Institute, and the Claire Tao Professor of Political Science at Barnard for moderating the question and answer session. Finally, I'd like to recognize the Georgian ambassador to the US, David Bagradze, who is in the audience today. We are fortunate this afternoon to be joined by Salome Zourabichvili, the President of Georgia. Hers is a remarkable story of a European diplomat who left the country of her birth to join the government of her ancestral home and quickly ascended to its highest office. President Zourabichvili was born in France into a family of Georgian immigrants who had fled the country in the 1920s after the Soviet invasion. She attended the Institute of Political Studies in Paris and moved to New York to continue her education here at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. In 1974, she began her career in public service by joining the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She was posted to the embassies in Rome and Washington, D.C., and represented France at the United Nations. In 2003, she was named French ambassador to Georgia. A year later, she joined the Georgian government as its Minister of Foreign Affairs. She went on to establish her own political party and successfully ran for a seat in the Georgian parliament. In 2018, she became the country's 5th president. President Zourabichvili has come to Columbia today to discuss the road ahead for Georgia. Following the Rose Revolution in 2003 that ushered in new leadership, the country has made strengthening its relationship with the West a national priority. Leaders have openly expressed their desire for EU and NATO membership. They have undertaken significant political and economic reforms. They have signed a free trade agreement with Europe, and Georgian citizens today enjoy free visa travel to the bloc. The turn west has caused a deep rift with Russia. In 2008, the nations went to war over 2 breakaway regions, prompting a Russian invasion of the country. Russia continues to challenge Georgia's territorial integrity through its recognition of and support for these breakaway areas. This past summer, tensions flared up again around anti-Russian protest in Georgia's capital. The title of the President's talk this afternoon is Georgia, Land of Attraction and Opportunities Despite Conflicts, a Regional Player with Euro-Atlantic Drive. Please welcome me in joining Madam President. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for receiving me here, for receiving me home a little bit, because I was saying that I've been here. But if I count the years, I am scared because it's almost 50 years, I think, so it's very long time ago. But I always will remember Columbia and Columbia years as my student and youth years, and a very fruitful experience in many grounds to discover United States, but also the system of education, and we're just discussing that. And I think that it, in many ways, shaped me as maybe a more audacious and free person than I would have been otherwise. So I engage you to really take full opportunity of this fantastic possibility that you have of studying here in much more modern buildings than the one that I used to have here. I want to start this this presentation, I'll try to be brief so we can have exchanges. But I want to start because today is 27th of September, and in 1993, Georgia was hardly independent. 1991 is when Georgia recovered its independence. And in 1993, this day, on the 27th of September, Sukhumi, the capital of Abkhazia, fell to what was shown as being a conflict with Abkhazians, but was in reality the first, not the first, but one of the conflicts with Russia. And as a result, 300,000 IDPs had to leave through the mountains of the Caucasus and Svanetia. They had to leave Abkhazia. And to this day, they are in Georgia, unable to go back to their homes and land in the Abkhazian region. So I want to remember this date. It's a tragic date for Georgia. As is tragic, the conflicts that we've had in the latter period, although they are not new to Georgia, which the history of Georgia has been a very long history of invasions. You can hardly cite, quote, any empire that has not been at one point in time invading, sometimes occupying for short or longer periods of time, parts of the territory of Georgia. That's the tragic part. But the good news is that Georgia has resisted all that and has come up to this 21st century as a modern state, as an independent state, as a democratic state. So that's probably the most, what we have to remember when we're thinking about the difficulties of today. We have to remember that there is this past and that the probability, if we have come that long, the probability that we will still resist and overcome the difficulties of today. So yes, there are difficulties. The new form that these conflicts have taken since the Russian-Georgian War of 2008 is that now we have two territories that are occupied in a full sense with Russian militaries there, with the occupation line being in fact guarded by the Russian forces. And military bases all over these two regions, military exercises, and so on. And very difficult humanitarian situation for our citizens, because they are our citizens living in both regions, who cannot have access to either education in their respective language, whether it's Abkhazian and Ossetian. The ethnic Georgians that remained after the departure of the 300,000 IDPs are now concentrated in two enclaves, one in Gali, where there are less than 15,000, and one in Akhalgori on the South Ossetian side. So those populations are in a very difficult also humanitarian situation because the crossing points with the territory of Georgia proper, as it is improperly said, are sometimes closed, very often closed, on and off, at different times and without prior advertisement, and then they cannot enjoy the benefits that we're offering to our citizens, which is to have free medical treatment, free education, access, and also some business opportunities that are today available to the Georgian citizens and that are part of our economic development. So this is a constant and a daily concern, and more than a concern, it's a daily tragedy sometimes. We have hostages taking in the villages that live close to the occupation line. They do not know where they can cross, where they cannot. And that means that we are under the possibility at any time of having incidents. And it's, of course, creating a pressure both on the populations and on the authorities. At the same time, and because there is always good news after the bad news, the good news are that this situation has not prevented Georgia from doing what it has to do and continuing on the path that was started right after the independence of Georgia, which was a path towards the European Union and towards NATO. In fact, the President Shevardnadze was the first one to establish that as a priority of Georgia very early on, as soon as Georgia became independent in 91. And that has remained with more and more accents, but that has remained the path of Georgia despite everything, despite the frozen conflicts, as they were called, and then despite the war and despite the occupation. And if the end objective of the wars and occupation was to divert Georgia from this Euro-Atlantic path, then it has not succeeded. And then it's Georgia that has succeeded, because what has happened in a constant period of 27 years, what has happened is that Georgia has marked very clearly the different stages of its rapprochement with European Union and NATO. It has gone from being simply a neighbor of part of the neighborhood policy of the European Union, then moving to the Oriental Partnership, and from there on to the associate member status. And then we have had free trade agreement with the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union, and then the visa liberalization. When I came back to Georgia in 2003, first as a French ambassador and then as a foreign minister, I would have never dreamt that one day we would have a visa liberalization with the European Union. That would have been something that, if I had said that to someone, somebody would have told me you're crazy. And here we are today. So the lesson of all that is that you can always be more ambitious than what the reality tells you, and always be striving a little bit above what is the reasonable prospect. And we do not need reasonable prospects in the region where we are, because it's a complex region, and we have one very complicated neighbor in the north. But we also have a region that is complex per se, because we have two neighbors that have been at war with each other. And of those two neighbors, we have two compact minorities of, that count each around 300,000, 250,000, and they live on the Georgian territory. Armenian descent Georgian citizens or Azeri descent Georgian citizens, and they are living and coexisting on the Georgian territory without, despite the times when their home back states are at war, in Georgia they are living next to one another, and that's a very big achievement. But that remains a complex region. We have another neighbor, which is our first economic partner, which is Turkey. And of course, for us, any tension that can happen between Turkey, our economic partner, and the United States, that is our strategic partner, is always something for concern and preoccupation. And that has happened lately with the discussions on the arms sales from Russia to Turkey. So we need to have our perspective very clear when you are in a region like that. And our perspective is clearer and clearer. It's getting closer to the European Union and NATO. And you're going to ask me then, how do you do that when the European Union is not ready to open up to new membership? And how do you do it when NATO is not open up to new membership? That's when you need to be both realist and ambitious. You need to be realist and knowing that what they're not going to do today is something that you cannot force them to do. And nobody is going to force the European Union to make a political decision on membership or on candidacy at this stage, and nobody is going to force open the door that is declared open of NATO. But there are many other things that we can do, and we can be today And that I think is very interesting and very promising. We can be the partner to the European Union and also to NATO that can with them invent the way of what do you do with your immediate neighbors to progress towards the future enlargement, in what form we don't know, without focusing and being paralyzed by the issue of status. And in many conflicts or in many difficult situations, the one way out is status neutral. So you put aside the question of the status and the votes and the political decision, and you move forwards trying to see where is it that you can really today and immediately enter the European Union. And when you do that, you discover that there are many places and that European Union needs also you in order to show that it's not completely closing in, that it's not a dead project, that it's very much alive. And we are the ones that show the European Union that it is alive and it can move and it can still offer a new perspective. And what I say for European Union is also true for NATO, because it's two very parallel paths and situations. And there is our real I would say, comfort and reason for self-confidence that we've been able to do that, and we are still able to find new ideas and new forms at the time when maybe somebody else will be completely turned in and looking only at the conflicts on this occupation line, and that would distract us from what is really important, that Georgia has to exist. Georgia should not be known outside in the world only through the conflicts. That's a very destructive way of looking. It should be known for what it is, a country that has existed for many, many centuries, that has been tolerant for many, many centuries and continues to be so, a country that is very dynamic economically, that is developing democratically, that has a very vivid democracy, sometimes too much, I would say, and that has many things to offer to the rest of the world. Of course, we shouldn't forget the conflicts, and we should be all the time very clear about the fact that our partners, if they are our partners, should keep this issue on their agenda, should keep this issue on the agenda when they talk to the Russians, because that's the way you insist and repeat and recall that there is an abnormal situation that has to be one day corrected, that this is not in conformity with even the ceasefire agreement that was signed in 2008, that we need to go back to a normal neighborly relationship, that there is no way in the long term that a region can be stable if we do not find the way to re-establish these normal relations. But that's what our partners have to do. And at the same time, we have to be known for many other things, culture, for instance, which is extraordinary. And while being here at the General Assembly during this week, I've been also visiting the Metropolitan Opera, because one of these days you have to see a Georgian opera presented in the Metropolitan Opera, and you will discover something that you didn't know and that is very interesting. And I was also at the MoMA, because we want to show you the Georgian avant-garde of the 20s, which will demonstrate without having to talk about it that Georgia then was already European, that Georgia then was already free, that Georgia then was already democratic. We are the country that elected women in our parliament in the 20s. 5 women were elected. That's when Georgia was independent. And we have the first ever Muslim woman elected in 21. And that maybe is much more important than my election today, which is very normal. Thank you. So now you can shoot.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Cooley. I have the pleasure of moderating today's Q&A session with President Zourabichvili. I'd like to propose the following. There are 2 microphones that are making their way down the aisles. If you have a question, please line up, use the microphones. I ask, please identify yourself, and a reminder, everything today is on the record. We are being live streamed globally, so please bear that in mind. And the format I'd like to use is to go alternating questions, and then perhaps towards the end to bundle the questions if we can. So let's start over here, please. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Joseph Epstein. I'm a student here at Columbia at the School of General Studies. I'd like to thank you, Madam President, for coming here to speak. And I would like to ask you a question. You spoke a lot about democracy, and I was wondering how you could reconcile your speech about democracy with the fact that your last election was won by what could be considered desperate voter buying tactics by an oligarch who himself makes most of the decisions in the country. So I want to ask you, is a country run by an unelected, informal leader really a democracy?
Should I answer it?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. I think that it's not exactly a right, precise, I would say, description of the situation in Georgia. In fact, the Georgian democracy, we have had a new constitution that is probably one of the most progressive constitutions today, including a number of social rights that was adopted last year. We have moved to a complete parliamentary regime, with one exception, is that I'm an elected president, but the next president will be elected by the parliament at the same time that there will be the parliamentary elections. The descriptions about the oligarch, I will not say anything because there are many oligarchs that are in power in different countries, and some very close to us. But if we know what is the definition of an oligarch, which I don't really know in this day and age, if it's only talking about a person that is rich, it's one thing. And the most important thing that one has to say is probably the fact that the power that you're describing is due to the election. The party of Mr. Ivanishvili, whom you were talking about, has won twice the elections, and he's the head of the party, and as in any other parliamentary regime, yes, the head of the majority governing party is powerful.
Thank you.
So,
no, I'm sorry. Just in the interest of including as many people we can't take two-part questions. So let's move over here, please. Yeah.
Gamarjova, Kabatono Salome. My name is Kendra, and I was living and working in Georgia for the past 2 years in the town of Tkibuli. I'm sure that you're aware of it lately. So with the London summit coming up, my question is related to NATO. I was wondering, why do you think that Georgia's NATO membership hopes keep faltering? And also, what do you think about some people's idea of Georgia accepting NATO membership without the protections of Abkhazia and South Ossetia? Thank you.
So why NATO? Because I think it has been always clear that the Georgian path is the path that brings Georgia back to where it belongs, without any doubt. And you have been living in Georgia, and you know how much Georgians feel themselves Europeans, and how much Europeans they are to the eyes of any foreigner that comes. And NATO is a complement in the eyes of the Georgians to this European, and that's part of the European security. And I think it's very natural, and that's how it's been true of all the countries that are former Soviet republics, which is a word I don't like at all. But all the former Soviet republics have been looking to where can they find their security. Because the one major concern that I've had, and we still having today, is of course through the conflicts, it's how do we defend our security. And since the European Union was not proposing the architecture of security that would answer those concerns of these countries, then it was naturally NATO that was, and NATO, and through NATO, the protection of the United States, and that was a very strong appeal, and is a very strong appeal for Georgia. And the support of the population to those two objectives that cannot be dissociated in Georgia is so strong that today, despite sometimes the fact that it takes a long time, Today we have more than 70% of support in the Georgian population for both the NATO integration and a bit higher for EU integration. And it has not changed over the years that we have gone through. It has not changed even when sometimes the European Union is doubting what it is going to do with these very avid neighbors of coming in. It has not changed when we know very well that there is not going to be a map decision, and there was no map decision before. But we at the same time know that we are completely ready, that we have been passing the steps one after the other, the tests after one and the other. We have achieved interoperability, and that is very good for us, beside the fact that it's necessary. The fact that Georgia has been participating and is one of the now front contingent in Afghanistan is something very important, because there we feel that we are part of a common struggle, common fight against terrorism. And it's also very good for Georgia because the Georgian military have been working hand in hand with the Germans, with the French, with the Americans, and that gives us a sense of security by itself, because then you're part of a family. That doesn't mean we're not under Article 5. We know that, and we're not going to be probably for some time. And as to the last question, it's a question that I cannot answer, first of all, because it's just an hypothetical question that is not a proposal by NATO, and as a president, I can only discuss on formal proposals that could be made. And if I were talking as a citizen, and not as a president of Georgia, then I would say you have seen Sophie's Choice, the film. That's already an old one, but you probably remember. I think that would be that type of dilemma and choice for Georgia if that were ever to be formulated directly.
Yeah. I would like to follow up on that just from the perspective. I think you've made a case for setting aside issues of status of Abkhazia and South Ossetia as you pursue this integration. But turning to the conflicts themselves, what do you envision as some of the next practical steps that can be taken to enhance regional security in your relationships with the territories?
Well, there are two main directions, and one that we are already implementing, and which is extremely important because of the number of years that are passing, and that is keeping the ties. So we have a very extensive policy that is called Step for a Better Future, which implies that we are offering medical treatment, education, possibility of common business opportunities to the citizens that are living on the other side of the occupation line, in order to avoid what could happen at any time, which is the populations growing apart, and especially the younger generation. So that's from our side, and probably more can be done in that direction through our partners, because we are not doing enough of organizing possibilities for exchanges, meetings, and common thinking outside of Georgia. That was done a little bit earlier on, and in recent years that has not been used as actively, and I think it's extremely important that not to lose the connections. So that's one side. The second is pressure by our partners in their dialogue with Moscow. When I say pressure, it's obviously not military pressure. We have renounced the use of force unilaterally. So it's not a question of military pressure that would only add to the instability or to the tension in the region, but it's pressure in all the dialogue formats on Russia to remind Russia of the agreements that they have signed in 2008 when President Sarkozy negotiated the ceasefire agreement. And there are elements in this ceasefire that could be really steps forward. One element like that is the mandate of the European Union monitoring mission, which in the text of the agreement is supposed to cover the whole territory. And hence really give a sense of more security. Today, the reality is that the EUMM, as it is called in abbreviation, can only operate on our side of the occupation line. So one of the negotiations that our partners could have as they are developing their relations with Moscow would be to bring Moscow to accept that the UMM, which is not a military force, which doesn't present any form of danger to the security of anyone, could be allowed to really cover a wider zone, and that would really decrease the incidents and not allow the tensions and the provocations that can happen at any time and with which we have been living for the past months, but not only months. It has been an ongoing situation.
Thank you. Let's get back to the questions, please.
Hi, my name is Nicole. I'm a first year here at Columbia College. I'd like to thank Madam President for coming here to speak today. So I have family in Abkhazia, and I visit there every summer, and I can still see the impacts of the conflicts that happened in the 1990s. And you've touched upon this in your response to the previous question. But I was just wondering, what are routes that world leaders can take to solve territorial conflict without military intervention? And are you willing to recognize Abkhazia as an independent nation?
The answer to the last question is no, but there are many ways in which one can treat the question. There are only two ways of resolving a conflict that exists. One is war, and we have renounced the use of force. The other one is dialogue, diplomacy, and using that, and imagination, because there are always forms that can bring us to find a way in which we can accommodate the different demands and the different preoccupations of populations that are living there. That is not something that I could now, because it has to be discussed and it has to be found probably together. But we shouldn't be divided by others, and we shouldn't be exploited by others or manipulated by others to solve what are conflicts and to try to divert us from a common future that has no alternative.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Tara Jose. I'm French and a former student at Columbia. My question for you today is, I'm wondering how your dual citizenship background helps you and hinders you in your day-to-day leadership. And finally, what are the 2-3 things that Georgia can teach the world today?
My dual citizenship is no longer a dual citizenship because I have renounced as soon as I was elected as president of Georgia. And I think that it has helped a lot. And it continues to help. And the idea that I'm both, and I was French and European and Georgian all at the same time, it has not hindered the French side at the time. Everybody knew, and Pierre is there, how Georgian I was. And despite that, I was considered as a French diplomat to be trusted. And I think the same is true today. I do not have to reject my French education or my French past. I think it's viewed by the majority of Georgians, and of course there are always differences of view, but it's viewed as a bridge. I think that the European side is considered as an asset that opens some doors that wouldn't be open if I was not what I am, which is this duality. So of course I'm also criticized. Sometimes I'm told that I don't speak a good Georgian enough, and it also is a problem sometimes for me because I've not been raised or educated in Georgia. So that means that I don't have a network in Georgia of my earlier years friends. I've more here from Columbia or from Sciences Po than I have for Georgia. So that makes sometimes things more complicated, but I think that all in all, it's effectively more an asset than a hindrance. And the second question was?
Things that Georgia can teach the world today.
I think the first thing is tolerance. Tolerance has been, and we are not projecting it enough, we have 27 centuries of coexistence with the Georgian Jews that have come from the first diaspora. And we are the only one country that as Israel is saying, that doesn't have to excuse itself of anything, and we have never had any incident in this coexistence of 27 centuries. And I think that tells a lot about the relationships that exist. We have in the two major cities of Georgia the synagogue, the Muslim and the Georgian Orthodox, the Armenian church, all of that in a few steps apart. In recent years, I've mentioned the populations of Armenian and Azeri descent, which are not only living on the Georgian territory, living in a compact way, and mostly being taught in their own languages, which in my view as a president of Georgia, we should do much more in order for these minorities to really speak the state language, because otherwise it's a difficulty in allowing them to progress in the different elements of the society. But that tolerance has been again demonstrated in the recent years. For the past year, we had 1,500,000 Russian tourists visiting Georgia. No incident to record. They went back, and I think that they are maybe our soft power in Russia, which we didn't know existed, but that exists. That's one thing. So tolerance is my first answer. The second one is culture. We have an incredible, interesting, very mixed culture that has its European sides and its Persian, Turkish, all these invaders that succeeded themselves in Georgia have left something which we have incorporated because of the tolerance. And I think it makes for a very interesting cultural scene, which Europe should know better. And I think that it's one of my duties as a president of Georgia to be in a way an ambassador and the promoter of Georgian culture, both in Europe and in the United States, because that's where we become valuable, and then when we are culturally valuable, then you have to be defended.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hello, thank you so much for being here today. It's an honor to speak with you. My name is Diana Glebova, and I'm a student with Sciences in Colombia. And Ukraine and Georgia have several parallels, from a historical background in the Soviet Union to gaining independence in 1991 to the color revolutions and wanting a closer relationship with the EU and NATO, and unfortunately also being plagued by frozen conflicts with Russia. So my question is, what do you envision as a future relationship between Georgia and Ukraine?
It's not a future relationship, it's an actual relationship. I've already met President Zelensky twice since his election. I was there at his inauguration. Georgia and Ukraine, not only they have had the same path, but there is a lot of mutual sympathy among the populations of Georgia. And Georgians love Ukrainians, and I think that the reverse is true. And in addition to that, we have this parallelism of our past. Of course, Ukraine is a much bigger country. It's very different in many of its cultural elements and background, historical background and economy. But we have this sense of closeness that exists. And we are now working on with the President of Ukraine on paralleling and joining our efforts exactly for what I was saying in direction of the European, in order to progress together. We are two associate members that are really the front runners in that category, and we need to go and present to the new European Commission, to the new presidency, to the new parliament, our new common demands.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Abel Radian, and I'm a first-year student at Columbia University studying environmental science. And my question is, what are some possible solutions to Georgia's environmental issues such as land and forest degradation in relation to its economic development?
That's a very good question, because we are like everybody else. We are seeing the impact of the climate changes on our territory. We are seeing on our territory there are these incredible, beautiful Caucasus mountains with very high peaks and glaciers, and we see that they're melting partially. We are better off than in other mountainous ranges, but there too it's very visible. We have river flooding. We have not had major disaster, but that doesn't mean that we can ignore what is happening. So there is a lot of work from the authorities' side to prepare better the society, to be part, and I was there to participate to the climate summit. And I personally think it's very important. Sometimes one says, well, you're a small country, and it's true, we don't have gas emissions, we don't have a big industry, so we are not maybe that relevant in fighting the climate changes as are the very big countries that matter in terms of changing the effects. But we matter too. I think we have to have a voice, as many other small countries. And Georgia has a particularity that we are the country that has a unique biodiversity in today's world, a small territory where you have all the climates, practically all the flora that can be found, and many endemic species of flora and fauna also, because many species were originating from the Caucasus. And that has to be saved. So we have to be in the front, of course, of trying to do what we can on our side, and we have already many protected areas in Georgia that are very much appreciated by the tourists that come and they can go and visit. But we have to do more, and I think that it's one of the issues on which we need to have more international cooperation to support our efforts, because this uniqueness in biodiversity is not only for us, it's also for the rest of the planet.
Perfect. So I am mindful of the time and that we want to include as many people as possible. So what I'd like to do now is start maybe bundling some questions two at a time, and we can write them down. So yes, please. Yeah.
Hi. My name is Davila Sagatiana. I am visiting scholar at Columbia University, and I am exploring Soviet genocide in Lithuania. I also work in the Supreme Court of Lithuania, and my question for you is, what is official politics towards Soviet crimes during the occupation in Georgia? And are you planning to take any legal actions? Having in mind that 2 weeks ago, Lithuania won the case in European Court of Human Rights, which recognized Soviet genocide for the first time in international legal courts. So this is my question. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. And let's take one more here. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Zhang. I'm a first year at Columbia College, and my question is, as Georgia is attempting to align itself with the West, what impact have allegations that the U.S. president was electorally aided by Russia had on your foreign policy?
Okay. Too straightforward.
On the aspects of fighting in the European Court of Law, we have one case in the European Court of Law on the actions of Russia, but we have been we have been doing much less than some of the Baltic states I've been visiting, and also Poland, where I was very impressed by the way the memorials are made, the registration of everything that happened during this Soviet period is much more detailed, and in that we are very Georgians. We have not worked that systematically on it, and when I come and I see what has been done, we have a museum of occupation, but it's a small one and it's not as effective as what is happening in other countries. Maybe there we have been diverted by the fact that we have a continuous occupation, and that is occupying us and our minds more than the fact that you are already on the other side of the mirror makes it maybe more easy to concentrate on history, but it's a direction that we need not to forget.
Please.
And on the allegations, well, for us it doesn't change anything because whatever, that's a problem for the United States probably to sort out what happened or didn't happen. I think that it's problems to sort out for all countries what happens during election time, especially today, where it seems that it's becoming a trend to have more and more interferences in each other's elections, and I think nobody is completely immune to either allegations or to real facts. But for us, we are a country that is a strategic partner of the United States and a country that has been all these years and until today, and nothing has changed. We are a country that is supported by the United States, whatever the party in power. It's a bipartisan project, so to say. The bipartisan support has always been there. It's there today in the Congress, and it's there today. And so we are very confident that whatever happens in American elections next year, we will remain the best partner in the region for the United States.
Perfect. Let's take a couple more. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Dylan Richter, also a fellow Sciences Piste. And I want to first thank you for coming here, Madam President, but also I want to ask you about the Georgia-EU relationship, because you were already mentioning how Georgia wants to have a closer relationship with the EU, but I want to ask you what options are there still for Georgia to be closer to the European Union without membership, and is European Economic Area membership perhaps a valuable or attainable or realistic goal in the medium term?
Thank you. And yes.
Amar Jobat. I'm David Chitanava, first-year graduate student from Columbia Engineering. I have a question about cybersecurity. Russia has proven its willingness to launch computer-based attacks against other nations. Georgia was a victim of Russian cyber operation during the war in 2008 war. Since 2016, NATO made cyber operations part of its war domain, along with air, sea, and land operations for a better defense and respond attacks. My questions are, what are the lessons learned from the war 2008? What measure is being taken by Georgian government against this modern defense challenge? And what is contribution of Georgia in global cyber security? Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. So for the EU, our policy is very clear. It's to not wait and not focus on the status today and not force our European partners to say yes or no, because most probably it could be no, so we don't want to hear it. And while we don't hear it, we want to get into the European Union through all the possible doors that exist in the different policies and programs. And in that way, we might be able to offer the European Union an alternative that they are seeking today to get out of this situation in which they don't want the enlargement, but they cannot say no to any perspective. So they're also looking for means to resolve this contradiction. And I think that we call it sometimes sectorial integration or ad hoc integration in the different policies and programs. EEA is also one possible option, but a complicated one a little bit. But it's Europe à la carte, maximum Europe, and don't tell us no when we're not discussing the issue of membership. We're doing you a favor of forgetting the issue of membership for a little while, but you have to say yes to when, and in the sectors where we are ready. There is, of course, a give and take. We cannot ask anything. You have to be ready. There is even an idea of closing chapters of accession, but on a de facto basis without that having any impact and be seen as really a perspective that is already given. but only as an exercise to be moving closer and closer. So I think that we have many ways, and it's quite promising, and it's also interesting that it's quite understood and positively received by some of the member states with whom we had these discussions. Cybersecurity, that's the equivalent of those policies in which we want to get for the European Union. That's where we want to get with NATO. Because we've had our experience with cybersecurity and we continue to have problems. Essentially, of course, Russia is there. We also have Iran and China. And it's extremely important where we are to get a proper cybersecurity response, which Georgia today doesn't have. So we are working on that, but we clearly, it's one of the fields in which we need support, and it's one of our demands on, with our partners of NATO, that cybersecurity, together with Black Sea security, become the two main priorities of our cooperation for the years to come. And that is what we are discussing with them presently, and where we are very hopeful that it will become the two central pillars of our relation with NATO.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple of more. If we can keep them concise. Yes, please.
Thank you, Madam President, for coming here. My name is Jarek Matzner, and I'm a senior here at Columbia College. And my question is, so in 2018, His Holiness in Beatitude Ilya II was voted the most trusted man in Georgian politics. He has a favorability rating of 90% and remains to a large extent the spiritual leader of the Georgian nation. And the separatist church of the, Abkhazian Orthodox Church is unrecognized by any other Orthodox authority, including the Russian Orthodox Church, but that might change if Ilya is not the head of the Georgian Church. And we naturally wish his beatitude all the best, but at the age of 86, it's not difficult to imagine that the Georgian Church might soon have a new patriarch. So do you think the end of His Holiness's term will be a turning point for the Abkhazia situation or Russia-Georgia relationship, given what happened with autocephaly in Ukraine? And also more broadly, maybe it's even like the turning point for the relationship between the church and the Georgian state, given, in the view of the EU accession and the church's view of the LGBTs, right?
Thank you. And yes.
Madam President, thank you for coming to speak today. I'm Akshay Chowdhury. I'm a first-year student at Columbia Engineering, and we focused a lot on foreign policy as it relates to Georgia today. But I wanted to ask that even though Georgia is clearly showing signs of progressing economically, it still faces a high unemployment rate and a worker skill set problem. So what steps is your administration taking to confront those challenges as Georgia moves technologically further in the global market?
Perfect.
Thank you. The church and the future of the Georgian church, I think that the future of the Georgian church will be the same as its past. Because what I was saying about the fact that Georgia has managed to come to this day, centuries and centuries of invasions, occupations, that has been possible because of the church. The church has been traditionally not only the spiritual guide of the nation, but maybe more the cohesion of the national identity around the church. And it's true not only in Georgia, but if I've remained Georgian while being born in France, educated in France, and spent much of my adulthood in France or in other countries, it's because there was a Georgian church that kept the immigration and their national identity together. It's true in all the countries where today we have large immigrations, that they are all centered around the church. So I'm sure whatever happens, maybe at the beginning the new patriarch will not have logically the same authority that has reached the patriarch today after years and years of really conducting his country. He was sometimes compared, and I think it's a very interesting comparison and very true, to Moses, because for 40 years he has been conducting his country out of the realm of the Soviet and post-Soviet and bringing us to really the today's European situation. So I think it will remain a very major central force in Georgia. For the economic situation, it's true we have not talked enough, and that's our main problem, the high unemployment, although it has been reduced a little bit, but that's far from being sufficient. That's one of the reasons why we continue to have a high migration towards Europe and the United States. And we have, and we all know that when we're dealing every day, we have at the same time a problem of high unemployment, and you don't find people when you need skilled, qualified, competent people when you have jobs vacancies to fill. And that, I think, is a problem of many countries. So we are trying to fight that. We're trying to convince the Georgian population that we have to move to vocational training and professional education, which is very difficult in a country that's where the old mentality stays, where in Soviet times Georgia was known as being the country with 90-something% of university diplomas, and where each citizen had at least 2 university diplomas. So it was considered as really the sign of status in the society. And so it's even more difficult for a country like that to make people understand that if you want a job, you have to go through a professional training and education. And then if you want higher education, it's something that you can achieve by yourself. So we are in that process. The second aspect of the policy is to go towards circular migration and sign what we are doing with our partners, especially in Europe, to sign circular migration agreements so that people can go on a temporary basis and work legally instead of going in illegal migration, and get some qualification and come back with that qualification. But that's the most difficult challenge that we have in the economy.
We are almost out of time. A very concise question, please.
My name is Alex Gordon. I'm a first-year student at the dental school, and my parents are Russian-speaking immigrants from Moldova, another ex-Soviet state. You have spoken a lot about Georgia's increasing diligence and success in establishing strong relations with the West. However, for Georgia and many ex-Soviet states, the reality of a Soviet past is very recent. So I want to ask, taking this into account, do you foresee any advantage in maintaining a Russian cultural or linguistic presence in the country, despite the difficult past associated with it?
Thank you, and that will be our final question.
My final question. Well, that is not up to us. And in fact, when I was 15 years ago, was it, negotiating the Russian military bases with my counterpart then, which was the same as today's Sergei Lavrov, one of the arguments that I was presenting for finding a solution, and then we found the solution, and that was before the next round of and one of my arguments was to say, well, you're losing, in fact, by having these military bases and some forms of confrontation. You're losing Georgia as a neighbor country that is close to the Russian culture, the language that was spoken by everyone. Today, that's no longer true. The younger generation practically either doesn't speak Russian or speaks a bad Russian. Practically no one goes to study today in Moscow. Everybody wants to come here, to go to Europe to study. And so this cultural influence that would be natural between a large country and a small neighbor has practically disappeared due to the Russian policy, not due to the fact that we're closed. And what is interesting, and that's again Georgian tolerance, when the Russian tourists come to Georgia, unlike what is the case in some other states, everybody that knows Russian speaks Russian to them, and there is no restriction on that aspect. But it's very clear that the Russian culture has lost ground in Georgia because of the Russian policies and not because of any interdiction or action on the part of the Georgian authorities or the Georgian society.
Thank you. Well, President Zourabichvili, you have covered a lot of grounds, both.
I could continue.
Yes, this has been just a sensational Q&A. On behalf of Colombia, I want to thank you for honoring us with your presence today.
It's a pleasure for me.
Wish you best of luck with all the opportunities and the challenges that Georgia faces, and we hope to see you again back here here in New York and at Columbia. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Esteemed guests, please remain seated as we escort Her Excellency Salome Zourabichvili and her delegation out of the building.